Somewhere beneath the sands of southern Iraq, buried under thousands of years of dust, lies a world that gave birth to writing, law, and the very idea of the divine as we understand it today. Long before Zeus threw his first lightning bolt, before Odin lost his eye, there was a pantheon so old that the gods of Greece and Rome may have quietly borrowed from it. Tonight, we're going back to the very beginning, all 14 Sumerian gods explained. If you enjoy these in-depth looks at history, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It really helps bring these relaxing documentaries to a wider audience. Now, let's get to the episode. An, the Sky Father who started it all. In the beginning, according to the people who lived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers nearly 5,000 years ago, there was only water. A vast formless sea called Namu, and from that sea came the sky and the earth, locked together as one. The being who would eventually rule the sky, separated from the earth below him, was called An. Namu herself is a fascinating and often overlooked figure in this cosmology, sometimes described as the primeval mother from whom all other gods ultimately descended. A formless, boundless ocean existing before time, before light, before any of the structure and hierarchy that would come to define the world the Sumerians actually lived in. Unlike nearly every other deity we'll discuss tonight, Namu rarely appears as an active character with her own dramatic myths. She functions instead as a kind of cosmic backdrop, the raw, undifferentiated potential from which everything else eventually emerged. A reminder that even the most organized, hierarchical pantheon the Sumerians could imagine ultimately traced its origins back to something far more ancient and formless than any single god's individual story could capture. And was not a god of drama. He didn't hurl thunderbolts or wage war on rivals the way later sky gods would. An was something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. He was distance itself. He was the sky as an idea rather than a character, the ultimate authority whose presence was felt more than seen. The Sumerians pictured him as the literal vault of heaven, the ceiling of the universe, and his name simply meant sky in their language. What made An so important wasn't what he did, but what he represented. He was the source of all legitimate power. Kings did not simply declare themselves rulers in Sumer, they needed An's blessing, or at least the blessing of the priesthood that claimed to speak for him. When later, more active gods rose in prominence, they still had to be recognized by An to hold real authority. Think of him less as a king actively running a kingdom and more like a retired monarch whose signature still had to appear on every important document. Sumerian king lists and royal inscriptions consistently invoke "and first among the gods" when establishing a ruler's legitimacy, even in periods when the actual center of religious and political power had clearly shifted toward Enlil's city of Nippur or another rising power center entirely. This insistence on naming An first, even when his practical relevance to daily governance had faded, reveals something important about how the Sumerians thought about legitimacy itself, that it needed to be traced back to an original, foundational source, regardless of how many layers of practical authority had been built on top of it since. In this way, An functioned almost like a constitutional principle rather than an active ruler, a reference point whose authority didn't need to be exercised constantly to remain essential to the entire structure of Sumerian kingship. His primary home was the city of Uruk, one of the oldest cities in human history, a place that would later become famous as the home of the legendary King Gilgamesh. Uruk's great temple complex, the Eanna, was dedicated to An, and its name literally meant House of An. Beneath layers of mud brick and millennia of sand, archaeologists have found evidence of temple structures here dating back over 5,000 years, some of the oldest religious architecture ever discovered. The scale of Uruk itself is worth pausing on because it helps explain why An's authority carried the weight it did. At its height, Uruk may have housed tens of thousands of people behind walls that later legend credited to Gilgamesh himself, making it one of the largest urban settlements anywhere on Earth at that point in human history. A city of that size needed an explanation for why it held together, why disputes didn't simply dissolve into constant violence, why one ruler's word carried force over so many households. And, as the ultimate source of legitimate authority, was that explanation. Every mud brick wall, every canal, every law depended, in the Sumerian imagination, on a chain of legitimacy that traced back to him. Interestingly, An's consort was a goddess named Kai, whose name simply meant earth, and in the oldest layers of Sumerian cosmology, An and Ki were described as having once been fused together as a single mountain-like mass floating in the primeval sea of Namu. It was Enlil, born from their union, who was credited with the act of separating them, prying sky away from earth, and creating the livable space in between where gods, humans, and all living things could exist. This separation myth, simple as it sounds, established one of the most consistent themes across the entire pantheon: that order and habitable existence were not givens, but had to be actively carved out of a formless, chaotic beginning. An's role in Sumerian mythology often gets described by modern audiences as passive, and there's truth to that. He rarely appears as a character taking direct action in the myths that survive. Instead, he presides. He's the one who convenes assemblies of the gods, who confirms decisions, who exists at the top of a hierarchy without needing to constantly prove his dominance. In a pantheon that would later include gods of storms, war, love, and death, all of them jockeying for influence and attention, and remained above the fray, almost like the idea of kingship itself, rather than a king who needed to keep winning battles to stay on his throne. But there was a shift over time, and it's one of the more fascinating developments in Sumerian religion. As centuries passed and new cities rose to prominence, An's authority began to feel more symbolic than practical. The real power increasingly rested with his son, a god whose temper and decisions would shape the fate of humanity far more directly. That son's name was Enlil, and understanding his rise tells us almost everything about how the Sumerians understood power, punishment, and the fragile relationship between gods and the people who worshipped them. This gradual shift from An's authority to Enlil's active rule mirrors something historians observe constantly in the political development of Sumer itself, where the earlier cities were governed by councils of elders and assemblies before consolidating into the more centralized kingship that later dominated the region. Some scholars have suggested that the mythology of An's fading practical authority may reflect, in a distant and symbolic way, this actual historical transition from more communal forms of governance toward the powerful, singular kingship that characterized later Sumerian city-states, with the pantheon's own internal hierarchy evolving to mirror changes happening in the human society that worshipped it. Because as we're about to see, the god who took over from An didn't just rule the sky, he nearly ended humanity entirely. Enlil, the god who almost destroyed the world. If An was the quiet authority behind the throne, Enlil was the one who actually used it. He was called the Lord of the Air, sometimes described as the space between heaven and earth, the wind and storm that carried both blessing and devastation. Enlil's temple, the Ekur, sat in the city of Nippur, and Nippur wasn't just another city to the Sumerians. It was considered the spiritual capital of the entire civilization, a place where kingship itself was thought to be granted, regardless of which city actually held political power at any given time. Enlil's personality, as described across surviving tablets, is complicated in a way that feels remarkably human. He could be generous, granting fertility to the land and legitimacy to kings. He could also be wrathful, impulsive, and at times deeply destructive. And it's that destructive side that leads us to one of the most haunting stories in all of Mesopotamian mythology, a story that predates the biblical flood account by well over 1,000 years and likely influenced it directly. According to the surviving myth, humanity had grown so numerous and so loud that their noise disturbed Enlil's rest. This wasn't a metaphor for wickedness the way later flood myths would frame it. It was, according to the oldest versions of the story, simply that human civilization had become too populous, too noisy, too much for the god to bear. Enlil's solution was extermination. He decided to wipe humanity from the earth entirely, and initially he tried smaller methods, plagues and droughts, to thin the population and grant himself some peace. Each time, humans found a way to survive, largely because another god, Enki, kept quietly intervening on their behalf, whispering warnings to a mortal follower and instructing him on how to counteract each disaster. This back and forth between Enlil's frustration and Enki's compassion became a defining tension in Sumerian religious thought, but it reached its climax when Enlil decided that half measures weren't working. He proposed a flood. Not a partial flood, not a warning shot, but a complete and total deluge meant to erase every trace of human life from the earth. He gathered the support of the other great gods and swore them to secrecy, extracting a promise that none of them would warn humanity about what was coming. The secrecy of this pact matters enormously to how the story unfolds, because it wasn't simply Enlil acting alone out of personal irritation. This was a unanimous decision by the full assembly of great gods, meaning that every deity we've discussed tonight, and several we haven't, agreed at some point to let humanity drown without warning. This detail complicates any attempt to view the Sumerian pantheon in simple terms of good gods and bad gods. Enki's eventual decision to break this collective oath, even through a technicality, wasn't a case of one virtuous god correcting the cruelty of a single villain. It was one member of a unanimous divine council quietly defying the will of his peers at real personal risk because he couldn't bring himself to follow through on a decision he had already agreed to. Enki, bound by his oath, but unwilling to let humanity vanish completely, found a loophole that has become one of the most quietly clever moments in ancient storytelling. Rather than speaking directly to a human being, which would have broken his vow, he spoke to the wall of a reed hut, knowing that a man named Zeus, sometimes called Atrahasis in other versions of the story, was resting on the other side of it. Through the wall, Enki described the coming catastrophe and gave detailed instructions for building a boat, one with specific measurements, sealed with pitch, capable of holding not just Zeus and his family, but pairs of animals and craftsmen who could help preserve human knowledge and skill. The flood came exactly as promised. For 6 days and 7 nights, according to the tablets, the storm raged with a violence the text describes as terrifying even to the gods who had unleashed it. Some accounts describe the gods themselves cowering, frightened by the scale of destruction they had set into motion, distressed by the screams of the humans and animals drowning below them. When the waters finally receded and Zeus' boat came to rest, he emerged to find a world utterly silent, scoured clean of nearly all life. Enlil, upon discovering that humanity had survived after all, was furious. This is where the myth becomes genuinely tense, because for a moment it seems as though Enlil might try again, might insist on finishing what he started. But something shifts. Confronted by Enki and by the sheer fact of humanity's survival, and by the offerings that the surviving humans immediately made to the gods out of gratitude and fear, Enlil relents. Instead of destroying what remained, he grants Zeus immortality, a rare honor, and effectively accepts that humanity will continue to exist, provided its numbers are kept in check by natural limits like disease, famine, and infant mortality, harsh realities that the myth frames almost as a compromise rather than a punishment. What's remarkable is how this story lines up with, and likely predates, the flood narrative most people know from the biblical account of Noah. Scholars have long noted the structural similarities: the divine decision to flood the earth, the secret warning to one righteous man, the detailed instructions for an ark, the release of birds to test whether the waters had receded, and the eventual settling of the boat on a mountain. The Sumerian and later Babylonian versions of this story circulated for well over 1,000 years before anything resembling the Genesis account was written down, suggesting a deep and direct line of cultural transmission across Mesopotamia and into the texts that would eventually shape Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The version of this flood story preserved in the later Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero is named Utnapishtim rather than Ziusudra, adds a detail that makes the terror of that night even more vivid. It describes the storm as so overwhelming that even the goddess Ishtar, who had originally supported the plan to destroy humanity, wailed in regret once she saw the scale of the devastation unfolding beneath her, comparing herself to a mother mourning her own children. This detail, carried forward from the older Sumerian tradition, reinforces just how seriously Mesopotamian religion took the idea that even divine decisions could carry consequences the gods themselves hadn't fully anticipated. It's also worth noting how differently the Sumerian version treats its flood hero compared to later traditions. Ziusudra isn't chosen because of moral righteousness in the way Noah is often described. The tablets emphasize his piety and his relationship with Enki, but the flood itself isn't framed as a punishment for human wickedness. It's framed as an act of divine irritation and population control, a detail that tells us something important about how the earliest Mesopotamians understood their gods. Not as perfectly just moral arbiters, but as powerful beings with their own needs, tempers, and capacity for regret, closer in some ways to deeply flawed rulers than to the omniscient, purely righteous deity found in later monotheistic tradition. Enlil's character across Sumerian mythology continues to reflect this same duality. He's the one who decrees fate, who can raise a city to greatness or reduce it to rubble with a single word. Sumerian hymns describe cities that displeased him being abandoned, their people scattered, in language that reads almost like a warning to any city that might grow arrogant. At the same time, he's credited with inventing the pickaxe and teaching humans agriculture, gifts that allowed civilization to flourish in the fertile land between the two rivers. One surviving hymn describes Enlil's pickaxe in remarkably specific, almost technical terms, praising its handle, its blade, and its capacity to break the hardest ground, treating this simple agricultural tool with the kind of reverence usually reserved for weapons of war. This praise reflects just how central manual, backbreaking labor was to Sumerian civilization's survival, and how directly the Sumerians credited their gods, rather than simple human ingenuity, for the tools that made large-scale agriculture and canal building possible in the first place. The same god capable of drowning nearly all of humanity was, in the very same religious tradition, celebrated as the one who gave humans the means to till the earth and feed themselves, a contradiction the Sumerians never seemed to feel any particular need to resolve or explain away. There's a particular story about Enlil's early days that reveals just how seriously the Sumerians took questions of divine conduct. According to one myth, a young Enlil became infatuated with a goddess named Ninlil while she bathed in a canal. Despite her explicit refusal, he pursued her, and the encounter that followed was framed by the other gods as a serious transgression rather than something to be celebrated. The assembly of gods was outraged by his behavior and banished him to the underworld as punishment, a rare moment where a senior deity faced real consequences for wrongdoing rather than simply asserting his power over a weaker party. Ninlil, pregnant, followed him down to the underworld rather than remain separated from the child she now carried, and the myth becomes a strange, layered story about consequence, choice, and the god who would eventually father the moon itself. It's a story Sumerian scribes clearly felt uncomfortable smoothing over, and its survival across multiple copies suggests it was considered an important, if uncomfortable, part of Enlil's history. What makes this myth even stranger is what happens once Enlil and Ninlil actually reach the underworld together. According to the surviving tablets, Enlil, apparently anxious about the fate of the child Ninlil carried, since any offspring born in the underworld would be bound to remain there permanently, devised a plan involving disguise and substitution. He took on the appearance of the gatekeeper of the underworld, then several other underworld guardians in succession, and fathered 3 additional children with Ninlil under each disguise, children who could then remain below as substitutes, while the original child, the moon god who would become Nana, was permitted to ascend to the heavens instead. It's an unusual resolution by modern standards, one that trades one set of underworld-bound children for another, but it reflects how central the theme of substitution and exchange was to Sumerian ideas about the underworld, a theme that resurfaces later in the myth of Inanna's own descent and eventual escape. By the time later Mesopotamian civilizations, the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians inherited Sumerian religion, Enlil remained one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon, though he would eventually be overshadowed in Babylon by a god named Marduk, who absorbed many of Enlil's titles and stories. But in the oldest layer of Mesopotamian belief, the layer we're exploring tonight, Enlil was, for all practical purposes, the operating power behind existence itself. Feared more than loved, but never entirely without compassion. This eventual eclipse by Marduk is worth noting briefly because it illustrates the same pattern of gradual religious succession we'll see again later tonight with Nisaba and Nabu. As Babylon rose to political dominance over the older Sumerian cities, its patron god Marduk needed a mythological justification for his new supremacy, and Babylonian priests achieved this largely by absorbing Enlil's titles, his flood narrative, and even his role as chief executor of divine punishment directly into Marduk's own expanding portfolio of stories. Enlil never vanished from Mesopotamian religion entirely, continuing to be worshipped at Nippur for centuries afterward, but the political and religious center of gravity shifted decisively away from him as Babylon's power grew, a reminder that even the mightiest gods in this pantheon weren't immune to the same rise and fall of fortune that governed the human cities who worshipped them. And speaking of compassion, that brings us to the god who kept saving humanity behind Enlil's back, a god of water, wisdom, and quiet rebellion against his own brother. His name was Enki, and his story is where things get even more fascinating. Enki, the trickster god who loved humanity. If Enlil represented divine authority at its most severe, Enki was almost his mirror opposite. Where Enlil ruled through decree and consequence, Enki ruled through cleverness, curiosity, and what can only be described as genuine affection for the humans he helped create. He was the god of freshwater, of the Abzu, the cosmic underground ocean the Sumerians believed existed beneath the earth, feeding every well, spring, and river in the world. His main temple, the Abzu, stood in the city of Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves regarded as the very first city ever built, the place where kingship descended from heaven at the dawn of civilization. Enki's personality, across the surviving myths, is warm, mischievous, and endlessly resourceful. He's credited with organizing the very structure of civilization itself. According to one of the most detailed surviving myths, Enki traveled the earth assigning what the Sumerians called the Me, a term that doesn't translate cleanly into English, but essentially referred to the fundamental building blocks of civilization: kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, the arts of woodworking and metalworking, musical instruments, even concepts like the resolution of disputes and the practice of prostitution. Enki was the one who decided which cities and which gods would be granted which of these divine gifts, effectively designing the entire framework of organized society from the ground up. This role as a kind of divine architect of civilization made Enki uniquely beloved among the Sumerian pantheon, but it also set up one of the most entertaining myths to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, a story involving Enki, the goddess Inanna, and a spectacular amount of beer. According to the myth, Inanna, ambitious and eager to elevate her city of Uruk above all others, travelled to Eridu to visit Enki. He welcomed her warmly, and as befitting a proper divine host, the two began drinking and drinking. Cup after cup, toast after toast, Enki grew more expansive and generous with every round, until in his intoxicated state, he began gifting Inanna the me themselves, handing over dozens of the sacred foundations of civilization one by one, seemingly without registering the scale of what he was giving away. Inanna, sharper and more sober than her host, or perhaps simply better at pacing herself, accepted each gift eagerly and loaded them onto her boat, setting off for Uruk before Enki could reconsider. The sheer hospitality on display in this myth's opening scenes reflects genuine Sumerian cultural values around welcoming guests, and the detailed back and forth of toasts exchanged between Enki and Inanna, each one specifically named and described in the surviving text, gives the whole scene an almost theatrical, drinking game quality that would have been immensely entertaining to hear performed aloud, the audience likely anticipating with growing amusement just how much further Enki's generosity would extend before someone finally noticed the scale of what he was giving away. When Enki woke from his drinking bout and realized what he'd done, he panicked. He dispatched a series of monstrous servants to chase down Inanna's boat and reclaim the me before she could reach Uruk. What follows is an extended chase sequence, genuinely tense for a 5,000-year-old story, as wave after wave of Enki's servants catch up to Inanna's vessel, only for her clever attendant Ninshubur to fend them off each time. By the story's end, Inanna successfully delivers the me to Uruk, and rather than continuing to fight her over it, Enki accepts the loss with what the tablets frame as grudging admiration, essentially conceding that Uruk has earned its new status as a center of civilization. Each wave of pursuit in this chase sequence follows a similar pattern, and the repetition itself seems to have been an intentional storytelling device, building tension through escalation rather than variation. Enki dispatches a new set of monstrous creatures. They catch up to Inanna's boat at a specific named dock along the river, and Ninshubur, acting entirely on Inanna's behalf, negotiates or fends off each threat in turn, allowing the boat to continue onward. By the time the final pursuit is repelled, the sheer number of named locations and repeated confrontations gives the story an almost rhythmic, chant-like quality, the kind of structure that would have made it especially memorable and enjoyable to recite aloud during festivals or performances, a reminder that these myths were composed first and foremost to be spoken and heard, not silently read. This story tells us something important about how the Sumerians viewed Enki. He wasn't infallible. He could be outsmarted, he could be careless, and he was willing to accept defeat gracefully rather than escalate into destructive retaliation, a sharp contrast to how Enlil handled perceived slights. Enki's wisdom wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about how he responded to them. The sheer number of me involved in this story is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it illustrates just how comprehensive the Sumerians' vision of civilization really was. The surviving list includes not just grand concepts like kingship and priesthood, but remarkably specific and mundane items: the crafts of the carpenter and the metalworker, the arts of writing and counting, the making of musical instruments, the establishment of law courts, and even more unusual entries like the me of strife, the me of straightforward speech, and the me of deceit. To the Sumerians, apparently, even negative or troubling aspects of society, conflict, lies, prostitution, needed a divine origin and a place within the ordered structure of civilization, rather than being treated as simple accidents or failures. This inclusion of both virtuous and troubling elements within a single sacred list tells us that Sumerian religion didn't divide the world into simple categories of good and evil so much as necessary and unnecessary, ordered and chaotic. Modern translations of this me list continue to be debated among specialists, since many of the individual terms describe abstract social and religious concepts that don't map neatly onto any single English word, and scholars often disagree about whether a given entry refers to a concrete craft, an abstract virtue, or some combination of both. What remains clear across every translation attempt, however, is the underlying ambition of the list itself, an attempt to catalogue literally everything that made organised civilization possible, from the highest ideals of justice and kingship down to the humblest details of daily craftsmanship, treating all of it as equally sacred and equally worth preserving in the story of how Uruk came to hold dominion over the cultural life of the entire region. That same generosity and cleverness defined his relationship with humanity as a whole. We already saw how Enki secretly warned Ziusudra about Enlil's flood, risking the wrath of the entire divine assembly to preserve human life. But this wasn't an isolated act of kindness. Across multiple myths, Enki consistently positions himself as humanity's protector and advocate within the divine court, often working around the more rigid or punitive instincts of gods like Enlil. One particularly striking story involves Enki's role in the creation of humans themselves. According to the myth, the lesser gods, tasked with the endless manual labour of maintaining creation, digging canals and irrigation channels under the blazing Mesopotamian sun, eventually rebelled. Exhausted and resentful, they laid down their tools and refused to continue working, threatening the very stability of creation. It was Enki who proposed a solution, the creation of humanity, formed from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, specifically so that humans could take over the burden of labour and give the lesser gods their freedom. The rebellion of these lesser gods, sometimes referred to in the tablets as the Igigi, is described with genuine sympathy for their exhaustion, the text noting that they had dug canals for decades, piling up mountains of excavated earth, their labour unending and thankless. When they finally surrounded Enlil's own temple in protest, weapons in hand, the senior gods realised the seriousness of the uprising and convened an emergency council to address it, ultimately landing on Enki's proposal as the only viable path forward. The god chosen to be slain and mixed into the clay from which humanity was formed was, according to the myth, specifically selected because he was considered the instigator of the rebellion, meaning that humanity's very physical composition was believed to carry within it a trace of that god's original rebellious spirit, a detail some scholars suggest may explain why the Sumerians saw restlessness and dissatisfaction as such a persistent feature of human nature. This creation story frames humanity's purpose in almost startlingly practical terms. We weren't made in a moment of pure artistic inspiration or as beloved children of the gods. We were made to work, to dig canals, to farm, to build temples, essentially to serve as a labour force that would let the gods live in comfort. And yet, within that transactional origin story, Enki still emerges as a figure of genuine warmth toward his creation, someone who continued to intervene on humanity's behalf, even when it meant defying his own brother. Enki's association with wisdom also connects him to one of the more unusual myths in the Sumerian tradition, the story of Adapa, a wise man and priest of Eridu who served Enki directly. According to the myth, Adapa was granted immense wisdom by Enki, but was denied immortality, and one day, while fishing, Adapa broke the wing of the south wind in anger after it had capsized his boat. This act drew the attention of An himself, who summoned Adapa to the heavens to answer for his actions. Before Adapa ascended, Enki warned him not to eat or drink anything offered to him in the heavens, believing it would be poison meant to kill him. Adapa's confrontation with the south wind is worth dwelling on briefly, since it establishes the very human, almost relatable flaw that sets this entire myth into motion. Adapa wasn't punished for some grand act of hubris or rebellion against the gods, the kind of transgression we might expect to trigger divine consequences elsewhere in this pantheon. He was punished, or at least summoned to account for himself, simply because he lost his temper after an ordinary frustrating mishap on the water, lashing out at a force of nature the way anyone might curse a sudden gust of wind that ruined their afternoon. This small human-scale moment of frustration ends up determining the entire future of humanity's relationship with mortality, a disproportion between cause and consequence that feels genuinely modern in its irony. Adapa followed these instructions faithfully, but the food and drink offered to him in heaven turned out to be the food and drink of eternal life, not poison at all. By refusing it out of loyalty to Enki's warning, Adapa unknowingly denied himself the chance at immortality and was sent back to Earth to live out a normal mortal life. Scholars have debated for decades whether Enki's warning was a genuine mistake, a test, or even a deliberate choice to keep humanity mortal and therefore dependent on the gods. The ambiguity itself feels intentional, a reminder that even the wisest and most benevolent gods in this pantheon operated with motives that weren't always fully transparent, even to their most devoted followers. This story of Adapa carried enormous cultural weight across Mesopotamian civilization for well over 1,000 years after it was first composed, copies of it turning up in the archives of Egyptian pharaohs at a site called Amarna, evidence that this particular myth travelled far beyond its Sumerian origins and was considered important enough to be taught to foreign scribes learning the cuneiform script as part of their diplomatic training. The tale's enduring popularity likely stemmed from the very question it leaves unresolved: whether humanity's mortality was a tragic accident, a deliberate divine decision, or simply the natural order of a universe where only the gods were built to last forever. That unresolved tension between fate and accident recurs constantly throughout Sumerian religious thought, and Adapa's story remains one of its clearest illustrations. Enki's symbol was the goatfish, a strange hybrid creature that would later influence the zodiac sign of Capricorn, and he was often depicted with streams of water, sometimes filled with swimming fish, flowing from his shoulders, representing the life-giving rivers and underground waters he governed. Temples dedicated to him often included elaborate water features and basins, physical reminders of his domain over the fresh water that made life in the arid Mesopotamian landscape possible at all. The city of Eridu itself, Enki's primary home, holds a special significance in Sumerian tradition as the place where the Sumerian king list, an ancient document attempting to record the lineage of rulers stretching back to the dawn of civilization, claims that kingship first descended from heaven. According to this tradition, before the Great Flood we discussed earlier, a series of legendary kings ruled in Eridu and other early cities for spans of time measured in the tens of thousands of years, figures whose reigns blur the line between historical memory and outright myth. Archaeological excavation at the actual site of Eridu has confirmed that it was indeed among the very earliest permanent settlements in the region, with religious structures on the site rebuilt and expanded across an almost unbroken span of many centuries, each new temple constructed directly atop the ruins of the one before it, a physical record of continuous devotion to Enki stretching back further than almost any other religious site anywhere in the world. By this point, we've met the sky, the storm, and the waters, But there's one more member of this founding generation whose story is often overshadowed by her more famous relatives, despite being central to almost every major myth of creation and kingship in Sumerian tradition. She was called the Mother of the Gods, and without her, none of the drama we've covered so far would have ever happened. Ninhursag, the mother goddess who shaped the earth. Ninhursag's name means Lady of the Sacred Mountain, and she occupied one of the most foundational roles in the entire Sumerian pantheon, serving as the mother goddess associated with the earth, fertility, and the creation of both gods and humans. She went by several names across different Sumerian cities and time periods, including Ninmah, meaning Great Lady, and Nintu, meaning Lady who gives birth, reflecting just how central her role as a creator figure was to Sumerian cosmology. This proliferation of names and titles across different regions is a pattern that appears throughout Sumerian religion more broadly, and it reflects the fact that Sumer itself was never a single unified nation in the way we might imagine a modern country, but rather a collection of independent city-states, each with its own dominant temple, its own local priesthood, and often its own preferred name or emphasis for shared deities. A goddess worshipped as Ninmah in one city might be venerated primarily as Nintu in another, with subtle variations in her associated myths and rituals depending on local tradition, even though both cities would have recognized her as fundamentally the same divine mother figure underlying all of creation. Ninhursag's most significant myth, and one of the most emotionally layered stories in the entire Sumerian tradition, involves her complicated relationship with Enki, a story that begins with paradise and ends with poison, betrayal, and an unusual method of healing that still fascinates scholars today. The myth begins in Dilmun, a paradise-like land the Sumerians associated with purity and abundance, a place, according to the text, where no sickness existed, no old age brought suffering, and even predatory animals lived without violence. It's often noted by scholars as one of the earliest surviving descriptions of a paradise garden, predating similar concepts in later Mesopotamian and biblical traditions by a significant margin. Many historians identify Dilmun with the real island of Bahrain and the surrounding Persian Gulf region, a place the Sumerians traded with extensively for goods like copper and pearls. And it's a striking thought that one of humanity's earliest recorded paradises may correspond to an actual physical trading partner rather than a purely imaginary realm. The text describing Dilmun goes out of its way to emphasize the absence of common hardships, noting that no raven made its mournful call there, no lion killed, no wolf snatched a lamb, and no one suffered the aches of old age, a portrait of harmony that stands in deliberate contrast to the harsh realities of daily life along the Tigris and Euphrates, where flooding, disease, and violence were constant threats. Within this paradise, Enki and Ninhursag came together, and their union produced a goddess named Ninsar. But rather than settling into a simple family narrative, the myth takes a strange turn. Enki, wandering the marshes, encountered his own daughter Ninsar and fathered a child with her as well, a goddess named Ninkura. The pattern repeats again, with Enki eventually fathering a child with his own granddaughter, creating an uncomfortable cascade of generational relationships that the original Sumerian audience would have understood within a very different cultural and religious framework than we have today, one where divine beings were not bound by the moral expectations placed on mortals, and where these unions functioned as symbolic representations of fertility and the generative power of fresh water meeting the earth, rather than as literal behavioral models. Each of these successive unions in the myth follows an almost identical narrative pattern, described with the same formulaic language. Enki spots a young goddess in the marshes, approaches her, and after a brief exchange, a new goddess is born 9 days later, a number that recurs throughout this section of the myth, and may reflect an accelerated symbolic timeline appropriate to divine rather than human gestation. This repetitive structure, much like the repeated chase sequence in the story of the stolen me, likely served a mnemonic and performative function, allowing those reciting the myth to build a rhythmic, almost hypnotic momentum as the story escalated toward its inevitable, consequential turning point. The consequence of this final union, however, is where the story shifts dramatically. The last goddess in this line, Utu, fled from Enki's advances, but Ninhursag intervened, advising Utu on how to protect herself. Despite this, Enki eventually found a way to approach Utu again, and after their encounter, in a moment of triumph, Enki planted 8 distinct plants that grew from the earth, unlike anything that had existed before. Curious, and perhaps unable to resist testing his own creation, Enki proceeded to eat each of these plants, one after another. This decision turned out to be catastrophic. Ninhursag, furious that Enki had consumed these new creations without her permission or involvement, placed a curse of death upon him. Enki began to sicken immediately, and the affliction spread through his body, striking 8 different organs, one for each plant he had eaten. As his condition worsened, the other gods grew increasingly desperate, watching one of their most vital members wither before them, unable to find a cure. It's at this point that a fox, of all creatures, intervenes in the story, according to some versions of the myth, negotiating with Ninhursag on the other god's behalf, and eventually persuading her to relent and heal Enki before it was too late. Ninhursag returned, and rather than simply reversing the curse with a single gesture, she performed a detailed and symbolic healing ritual, positioning Enki carefully and creating 8 separate healing deities, each one corresponding to a specific ailing body part. One of these deities, Ninti, whose name can be translated as both Lady of the Rib and Lady who gives life, was created specifically to heal Enki's rib. The fox's role in this myth, brief as it is, has intrigued scholars for the sheer strangeness of its inclusion, since tricksters and animal intermediaries appear relatively rarely in the more formal, temple-sanctioned mythology of Sumer compared to their prevalence in folk traditions elsewhere in the ancient world. Some surviving fragments suggest the fox negotiated a reward for itself in exchange for successfully persuading Ninhursag to relent, though the exact nature of this reward remains unclear in the damaged portions of the tablets that have survived. Regardless of the specifics, the fox's inclusion suggests that even the most serious and consequential myths in the Sumerian tradition, one involving the near death of a major god, could accommodate a moment of clever, almost folkloric intervention from an unexpected and comparatively humble source. This detail has captured the attention of biblical scholars for well over a century, given the striking resonance with the Genesis account of Eve being created from Adam's rib. While the Sumerian myth reverses the gender roles, with a female deity created to heal a male god's rib rather than a female being created from a male's rib, the linguistic pun connecting rib and life in the Sumerian language suggests this story may represent one of the deepest and oldest roots of an idea that would echo through religious traditions for thousands of years afterward. Beyond this single dramatic myth, Ninhursag's broader role in Sumerian religion centered on fertility, childbirth, and the raising of kings. She was frequently depicted nursing infant rulers, and Sumerian kings often claimed her as a divine mother figure to legitimize their right to rule, describing themselves in inscriptions as having been nourished by her sacred milk. Her symbol, an omega-like shape resembling a stylized womb or possibly a cattle pen, appears repeatedly in Sumerian art and iconography, reinforcing her connection to birth, nurturing, and the raising of livestock, which was central to the Sumerian agricultural economy. Beyond royal inscriptions, ordinary Sumerian households also invoked Ninhursag during the genuinely dangerous process of childbirth, an event that carried enormous risk of death for both mother and infant in the ancient world, lacking any of the medical interventions available today. Midwives and family members recited prayers and incantations calling on her protection throughout labour, and clay birthing bricks, physical platforms upon which Sumerian women were believed to have given birth while kneeling or squatting, were sometimes decorated with imagery connecting them directly to Ninhursag's protective presence. This intimate, deeply personal aspect of her worship, present in nearly every single household regardless of wealth or status, arguably made her one of the most universally relevant deities in the entire pantheon, touching the lives of ordinary Sumerian families in a way that more distant cosmic gods like An rarely did. Ninhursag's temples were often built on elevated platforms or artificial mounds, physically representing the mountains associated with her name and title. Unlike gods whose worship was concentrated primarily in a single city, Ninhursag's influence extended across multiple Sumerian city-states, a reflection of just how fundamental fertility and childbirth were to virtually every community across the region, regardless of which specific city held political dominance at any given moment. Her importance is also reflected in how frequently Sumerian and later Akkadian kings invoked her directly in their own royal titles and inscriptions, with rulers describing themselves as having been formed on her birthing bricks or nursed at her sacred breast, language meant to establish an unbroken, almost biological link between the ruling monarch and the divine mother of creation itself. This wasn't simply poetic flattery, it reflected a genuine belief that legitimate kingship required a physical, maternal connection to the goddess who had shaped the very first humans out of clay, tying political authority directly to the oldest creation stories the Sumerians told about themselves. We've now covered the sky, the storm, the waters, and the earth. But the Sumerians didn't stop at explaining the elements of their physical world. They looked upward into the night sky itself and found gods there too, watching over time, light, and the passage of every single day and night. And the story of how those celestial gods came to be involves a jealous rivalry, a kidnapping, and one of the most dramatic sibling conflicts in the entire pantheon. That story begins with the moon. Nanna, the moon god born from scandal. We already touched on the strange beginning of Nanna's story when we discussed Enlil's banishment to the underworld. Nanna, also known by the name Sin in later Akkadian tradition, was the child conceived during Enlil's transgression against the goddess Ninlil, born not in the comfort of the heavens, but during his parents' exile in the underworld itself. It's a striking origin for a god who would go on to represent something as calm and cyclical as the moon, but the Sumerians seem to embrace this tension rather than smooth it over. Nanna's primary cult center was the city of one of the most powerful and influential cities in Sumerian history, and his great temple there, the Akishnugal, became one of the most important religious sites in the entire region. Would eventually become so associated with Nanna worship that its most famous ruler, a king named Namu, oversaw the construction of the massive ziggurat dedicated to the moon god, a structure whose ruins still stand today in modern Iraq, remarkably preserved after more than 4,000 years. Nanna's role in Sumerian cosmology centered on timekeeping and the measurement of months, since the Sumerian calendar was fundamentally lunar, tracking time through the phases of the moon rather than the solar cycle. Every month began with the reappearance of the crescent moon after its period of invisibility, and this cycle was seen as a kind of divine reassurance, proof that order continued to prevail over chaos, that the god who governed the night sky continued his steady, reliable journey regardless of whatever conflicts were happening among the other deities. This lunar calendar created practical challenges that Sumerian priests and administrators had to constantly manage, since 12 lunar months don't align neatly with the length of a full solar year, gradually drifting out of sync with the agricultural seasons if left uncorrected. Sumerian and later Babylonian astronomers dealt with this by periodically inserting an additional intercalary month, essentially a leap month, to realign the calendar with the actual solar year and the agricultural rhythms it governed. This ongoing effort to reconcile Nana's lunar cycles with the practical demands of farming reflects just how much careful observation and calculation Sumerian priests devoted to tracking celestial movements, laying groundwork for the sophisticated astronomical traditions that later Babylonian scholars would become famous for throughout the ancient world. Unlike some of the more turbulent gods we've already discussed, Nana's mythology tends to emphasize stability and wisdom rather than dramatic conflict. He was often depicted as an elderly, bearded figure, a visual choice that reinforced his association with wisdom accumulated over countless cycles of waxing and waning. His symbol, the crescent moon, became one of the most recognizable divine emblems in all of Mesopotamian iconography, appearing on cylinder seals, boundary stones, and temple carvings across the region for thousands of years. One of the more touching aspects of Nana's mythology involves his marriage to a goddess named Ningal, whom the surviving hymns describe with genuine warmth and affection, a partnership that produced several of the next generation's most important deities. Their children would go on to govern the sun, love, war, and the underworld itself, meaning that in a very real sense, the quiet, steady moon god became the grandfather figure behind some of the most dramatic and consequential stories in the entire Sumerian pantheon. There's also a lesser-known but fascinating myth describing Nana's journey to Nippur to visit his father Enlil, bringing gifts in the hopes of securing blessings and abundance for his city of Ur. The journey, described in loving detail across the surviving tablets, takes Nana by boat along various rivers and canals, stopping at several cities along the way, each one greeting him with offerings and hospitality. It's less a myth of conflict and more a kind of divine travelogue, reinforcing the geographic and religious connections between Sumerian city-states and reminding listeners that even gods needed to maintain proper relationships with their elders to keep the blessings flowing. The physical remains of Nana's worship are some of the most impressive still standing anywhere in the region today. The great ziggurat of Ur, built primarily under King Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, roughly 4,000 years ago, rose in stepped terraces meant to bring the god's earthly dwelling closer to the heavens, its core built from sun-dried mud brick and its outer layers faced with baked brick set in bitumen to withstand the elements. Even in its partially ruined state today, having been restored in sections during the 20th century, it remains one of the most recognizable monuments of the ancient world, a physical testament to just how seriously the Sumerians and their successors took their obligation to house the moon god properly. Excavations at the site have also uncovered residential quarters, archives, and workshops surrounding the ziggurat, showing that Ur functioned as a genuine administrative and economic hub built around Nana's worship, not merely a ceremonial center visited occasionally for festivals. But calm as Nana's mythology tends to be, his son would inherit an entirely different kind of responsibility, one that required him to see absolutely everything happening on Earth, every single day, without exception. Nana governed the night. His son would govern the light that exposed every secret hidden beneath it. Utu, the sun god who judged the world. Utu, later known as Shamash in Akkadian and Babylonian tradition, was the son of Nana and Ningal, and he held one of the most demanding jobs in the entire pantheon. As the sun god, Utu's daily journey across the sky meant that he witnessed everything happening in the world below him, every action taken in daylight, every crime committed, every promise made or broken. This constant, unblinking observation made him the natural choice to become the god of justice, truth, and law throughout Mesopotamian civilization. The Sumerians believed that at night, Utu traveled through the underworld, continuing to illuminate that realm and maintaining a connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead, before emerging again each morning through gates located at the eastern horizon. This daily cycle of death and rebirth, of disappearing into darkness only to return triumphantly each dawn, gave Utu a symbolic association with resurrection and renewal that would echo through later Mesopotamian and even Egyptian solar mythology. Utu's primary cult centers were the cities of Sippar and Larsa, and his temples in both locations became major centers not just for religious worship, but for something surprisingly practical: the administration of justice. Because Utu was believed to see all wrongdoing, oaths were frequently sworn in his name, and his temples sometimes functioned as sites where legal disputes were formally settled, with the god himself invoked as the ultimate witness and guarantor of truthful testimony. Surviving legal documents from Sippar in particular show individuals appealing directly to Utu's temple to resolve disputes over land boundaries, inheritance, and unpaid debts, treating the temple less as a place of pure worship and more as something resembling a court of law where a case could be formally heard and a binding judgment issued. Witnesses in these disputes were often required to swear their testimony in Utu's name specifically, understood as invoking a punishment far more severe than any human court could impose should they be caught lying, since the god who saw everything happening beneath his daily path across the sky could hardly be deceived by a false oath sworn directly in his own temple. This connection to law and justice reaches its most famous expression centuries later, in Babylonian times, when King Hammurabi commissioned his famous Law Code. The stele depicting this code shows Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the descendant deity of Utu, reinforcing the idea that earthly law derived its legitimacy from the sun, God's cosmic authority to judge right from wrong. Even though this particular artifact comes from a later Babylonian context, it reflects a tradition of solar justice that stretches directly back to Sumerian beliefs about Utu. Long before Hammurabi's famous code, earlier Sumerian rulers had already established their own written legal codes under Utu's presumed authority, including one of the very earliest known law codes in human history, issued by a king named Ur-Nammu of Ur, roughly 2 centuries before similar codes appeared elsewhere in Mesopotamia. These earlier codes dealt with matters ranging from property disputes to physical injury to marriage and divorce, prescribing specific compensations and punishments for various offences, and their preambles frequently invoke divine sanction for the king's authority to establish and enforce these laws, a sanction that traced back through Enlil and An, but leaned heavily on Utu's role as the god who witnessed every transgression and therefore could vouch for whether justice had truly been served. Utu's mythology also includes a close and supportive relationship with his sister, a goddess whose ambition and complexity would make her one of the most compelling figures in the entire Sumerian pantheon. Across multiple surviving myths, Utu appears as a helper and advisor to his sister, guiding her through dangerous situations and offering counsel when she found herself in difficult circumstances. In one notable story, when his sister desired a husband, a shepherd named Dumuzi, Utu played a role in facilitating the match, demonstrating the kind of protective, supportive sibling relationship that stood in sharp contrast to some of the more antagonistic relationships elsewhere in Sumerian mythology. Utu was also credited with helping Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, on his famous quest to defeat the monstrous guardian Humbaba. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utu, moved by Gilgamesh's prayers and sacrifices, sent powerful winds to aid Gilgamesh in battle, winds that pinned Humbaba in place and allowed Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu to overcome a creature that would otherwise have been unbeatable. This episode reinforced Utu's role not just as a passive observer of justice, but as an active force willing to intervene directly when mortals demonstrated genuine devotion and righteous purpose. Utu's connection to Gilgamesh extended beyond this single episode as well, since Gilgamesh's mother, the goddess Ninsun, was frequently depicted appealing directly to Utu on her son's behalf before his dangerous undertakings, treating the sun god as a kind of protective patron for the ambitious young king. This relationship reflects a broader pattern across Sumerian religion in which Utu, more than almost any other deity, was approached directly by desperate or hopeful mortals seeking practical intervention rather than simply abstract blessing, precisely because his daily journey across the sky meant he was, in a very literal sense, always watching and always reachable. Depictions of Utu typically show him with rays of sunlight emanating from his shoulders, sometimes holding a serrated saw-like weapon that scholars believe represented his ability to cut through mountains at dawn, allowing sunlight to reach the earth each morning. This same weapon may have symbolized his ability to cut through deception and falsehood, reinforcing his connection to justice and truth-telling. Cylinder seals depicting Utu often show him in the specific act of rising between two mountain peaks, sometimes identified as the twin peaks flanking the eastern horizon, where the Sumerians believed the sun physically emerged each morning, his foot planted on the mountain as he pushes himself upward into the sky, his saw-toothed blade in hand as though actively cutting his way through the stone barrier that separated night from day. This vivid, almost muscular imagery of the sun god physically forcing his way into the sky each morning, rather than simply appearing passively, reinforced the idea that daylight and the justice it enabled were not automatic, effortless gifts, but something actively won each and every day through Utu's own persistent effort. Every single day, without fail, Utu made his journey across the sky, judging, illuminating, and maintaining the delicate balance between order and chaos that the Sumerians believed their entire civilization depended upon. But it's his sister we mentioned, the one he helped find love and guided through danger, whose story might be the most fascinating, most dramatic, and most quietly disturbing tale in this entire pantheon. She was worshipped as the goddess of love, sex, and war all at once, a combination that tells you almost everything you need to know about how unpredictable she truly was. Her name was Inanna, and what happened to her in the underworld is unlike anything else you'll hear tonight. Inanna, the goddess who died and came back. Inanna, later known as Ishtar in Akkadian and Babylonian tradition, was, without question, one of the most complex and compelling figures in the entire Sumerian pantheon. She governed love, desire, fertility, and somewhat jarringly to modern audiences, war and conflict as well. This apparent contradiction wasn't seen as strange by the Sumerians. To them, passion and destruction were two sides of the same overwhelming force, and Inanna embodied both without apology. Hymns dedicated to Inanna describe her in strikingly contradictory terms, even within the same composition, praising her as the one who turns men into women, and women into men, who brings both weeping and laughter, who can level mountains with her fury, and just as easily inspire the tenderest devotion. This wasn't viewed as inconsistency in her character, so much as evidence of just how vast and untamable her domain truly was. Unlike gods whose spheres of influence were narrow and clearly defined, Inanna's power touched nearly every intense human experience, and Sumerian worshippers approached her with a mixture of adoration and genuine caution, aware that her favour could just as easily curdle into devastating anger. Her primary temple was, as we've already discussed, in Uruk, and her acquisition of the sacred me from Enki cemented her city's status as a preeminent centre of civilization. But Inanna's ambition didn't stop at accumulating divine gifts and cultural authority. She wanted more. She wanted power over every remaining domain, including the one realm that no living god had ever successfully claimed dominion over: the underworld, ruled absolutely by her older sister, a goddess named Ereshkigal. Inanna's ambition, unlike the more destructive impulses we saw drive Enlil's flood, is never framed by the surviving texts as inherently wrong or excessive. Sumerian hymns celebrating her achievements list city after city, temple after temple, where her worship flourished, describing her rise to prominence with evident pride and admiration rather than caution. This makes her decision to descend into the underworld feel less like villainous overreach and more like the natural, almost inevitable, next step for a goddess who had already claimed dominance over nearly every other domain a deity could hold: love, war, and the accumulated wisdom of civilization itself. The underworld remained the one territory still entirely outside her control, and it's not difficult to imagine why a goddess of her ambition would eventually turn her attention there. The myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld is, by most scholarly assessments, one of the most sophisticated and emotionally layered narratives to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, and it begins with a decision that seems almost reckless in retrospect. Inanna decided to travel down to the underworld, ostensibly to attend the funeral rites of Ereshkigal's husband, though many scholars believe her true motivation was a bid to seize control of the underworld for herself. Before her descent, Inanna took a crucial precaution. She instructed her loyal servant Ninshubur, the same clever attendant who had fended off Enki's monsters during the chase for the Mi, to wait a specified number of days, and if Inanna failed to return, to go to the other gods and beg for help in rescuing her. This detail matters enormously to the story because it demonstrates that Inanna herself understood the danger of what she was attempting, even as she pressed forward regardless. The underworld, known as Kur, or sometimes Irkala, was described by the Sumerians in genuinely bleak terms: a place of dust and silence where the dead subsisted on nothing but dry clay, a shadowy realm ruled with absolute and merciless authority by Ereshkigal. To enter this realm, Inanna had to pass through 7 separate gates, and at each gate, a gatekeeper stripped her of one article of clothing or one piece of jewelry, removing her crown, her jewelry, her royal garments, piece by piece, until by the time she stood before her sister, she arrived completely naked and stripped of every symbol of power and status she had carried into the underworld. The specific items removed at each gate are listed with careful, almost ritualistic precision in the surviving tablets, and the sequence matters. First, her crown was taken, the symbol of her authority and status. Then her earrings, then the beads around her neck, then the ornaments covering her chest, then a golden ring from her hand, then a measuring rod and cord she carried as symbols of justice and order, and finally, at the 7th and last gate, her royal robe itself, leaving her with nothing at all. Each gatekeeper, when questioned by Inanna about why she must surrender these items, gave the same terse response: that this was simply the ancient, unquestionable custom of the underworld, a formula repeated 7 times that builds a genuine sense of mounting dread as the goddess loses more and more of herself with each threshold she crosses. This progressive humiliation wasn't incidental to the story. It represented a complete stripping away of Inanna's identity, her authority, everything that made her a goddess of consequence in the world above, leaving her utterly vulnerable before a sister who had every reason to resent her. And Ereshkigal did not show mercy. The moment Inanna arrived before her throne, Ereshkigal, along with a council of 7 judges, known as the Anunnaki, fixed Inanna with what the tablets describe as the look of death itself. Inanna was struck down, her body transformed into a corpse, and hung on a hook on the wall of the underworld, left there to rot. For 3 days and 3 nights, the goddess of love and war, one of the most powerful deities in the Sumerian pantheon, remained dead, her body left hanging in a realm from which nothing ever returned. Above, in the world of the living, Ninshaba waited exactly as instructed, and when the appointed time passed without any sign of her mistress, she went to the gods for help, precisely as Inanna had commanded her to do. It's worth pausing here on just how significant it was that a goddess of Inanna's stature could die at all, let alone remain dead for 3 full days. Nothing in the myths we've covered so far suggested that any of the great gods were mortal in the way humans were, and this sudden absolute vulnerability, a powerful goddess reduced to a rotting corpse on a hook, would have struck the original audience as genuinely shocking, a reminder that even divine status offered no protection once someone stepped outside the boundaries of their proper domain. Ereshkigal's underworld, in this sense, functioned as the one place in the entire cosmos where hierarchy and power meant nothing at all, where a goddess as beloved and formidable as Inanna was reduced to exactly the same helpless state as any dead mortal. Ninshaba's pleas were met with mixed responses that reveal a great deal about the personalities of the gods we've already discussed. She approached Enlil first, given his status as the most powerful god in the pantheon, but Enlil refused to help, reportedly stating that Inanna had brought this fate upon herself through her own reckless ambition, and that the laws of the underworld could not simply be overturned for anyone, even a goddess of her stature. Ninshaba then approached Nanna, Inanna's own father, but he too refused, offering a similar reasoning that the underworld's rules were absolute and could not be broken. This double rejection, first from Enlil and then from her own father, deserves particular attention, because it reflects the same rigid, rules-bound sensibility we saw earlier when Enlil refused to compromise on humanity's fate during the flood narrative. Both Enlil and Nanna aren't portrayed as callous or uncaring exactly, but as gods who prioritize cosmic order and the sanctity of established law above compassion for an individual, even a beloved family member. This consistency across separate myths suggests the Sumerians had a genuinely coherent theological vision of Enlil's lineage as representing structure and consequence, in direct and repeated contrast to Enki's lineage of compassion and clever workarounds. It was only when Ninshaba reached Enki, the same god whose compassion had already saved humanity once before, that she found someone willing to help. Enki, troubled by his daughter's fate, but faced with the same restriction that no one could simply enter the underworld and retrieve her by force, devised an ingenious solution instead of a direct confrontation. He created 2 strange, sexless beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, creatures so small and insignificant that they could slip into the underworld without being challenged by its guardians. He instructed these beings to find Ereshkigal, who at that point in the story was suffering the pains of grief, and possibly the pains of labor herself, and to offer her sympathy rather than opposition, echoing her cries of pain back to her with genuine, matching empathy rather than judgment or demands. This approach worked precisely because it was so unexpected. Ereshkigal, isolated and burdened by her role as ruler of a realm no one wanted to visit, responded to this genuine empathy by offering the strange creatures a gift in return. They asked for the corpse hanging on the wall, and remarkably, she granted their request. Enki's creatures sprinkled the corpse with the food and water of life that Enki had given them, and Inanna returned to life, rising from death itself. But the underworld's laws demanded a price, and this is where the story takes its final, most devastating turn. No one could leave the underworld without providing a substitute to take their place among the dead. As Inanna ascended back toward the world of the living, she was accompanied by a procession of demons, the Gala, whose sole purpose was to ensure that someone else would descend to take her place. Inanna travelled through several cities on her return journey, encountering various minor gods and attendants who mourned for her, dressed in sackcloth, genuinely grieving her apparent death. Moved by their loyalty and grief, Inanna refused to let the demons claim any of them as her substitute. The demons themselves are described in the surviving tablets with a chilling, almost bureaucratic thoroughness. Creatures who knew neither food nor drink, who accepted no offerings, who could not be bribed with gifts or moved by tears, whose entire purpose was singular and unrelenting. This detail matters because it strips away any possibility that Inanna could simply negotiate her way out of the underworld's demands. The exchange had to happen. Someone had to go down in her place, and the only real question left in the story was who that would be. But when she reached Uruk, her own city, she found something that shocked and enraged her. Her husband, the shepherd king Dumuzi, the same man Utu had helped her find and marry, was not in mourning at all. According to the myth, he was seated on Inanna's own throne, dressed in splendid clothing, seemingly enjoying himself, and showing no evidence of grief over his wife's supposed death. Furious at this betrayal, and perhaps at his apparent eagerness to enjoy power in her absence, Inanna made a decision that would define the rest of the myth and give birth to one of the most quietly heartbreaking stories in the entire Sumerian tradition. She pointed the demons toward Dumuzi and allowed them to drag him down to the underworld in her place. The consequences of this decision ripple outward into one of the most emotionally complex resolutions in ancient mythology, one that involves Dumuzi's desperate attempts to escape, the intervention of his devoted sister, and ultimately a compromise that would shape how the Sumerians understood the changing of the seasons themselves. But to understand how that resolution unfolds, we first need to properly meet the goddess whose realm claimed both Inanna and eventually Dumuzi himself. The ruler of the underworld, the goddess who received this endless procession of the dead with the same cold authority every single time. Her story is, in some ways, the most tragic of the entire pantheon, because unlike nearly every other deity we've discussed tonight, she never once got to leave the world she was condemned to rule. Ereshkigal, the queen who ruled the land of no return. Ereshkigal's name translates roughly to Queen of the Great Earth, and she governed Kur, the Sumerian underworld, with total and unchallenged authority. Unlike her sister Inanna, whose myths take her travelling across the earth, into the heavens, and even into the underworld and back, Ereshkigal's story is marked by a kind of permanence and confinement that the Sumerians themselves seem to treat with genuine sympathy rather than simple fear. According to Sumerian belief, once a soul entered the underworld, it never left. This wasn't a realm of punishment in the way later religious traditions would conceive of hell, with active torment for the wicked. It was simply a shadowy, dust-filled continuation of existence, stripped of joy, stripped of light, where the dead ate clay and drank from puddles, existing rather than truly living. And Ereshkigal ruled over all of it, alone, in a palace of lapis lazuli, attended by a council of judges called the Anunnaki, whose verdicts on the dead were absolute and unappealable. This vision of the afterlife stands in sharp contrast to how many later religious traditions would come to imagine what awaited the dead, and it's worth sitting with how genuinely bleak the Sumerian conception was. There was no reward reserved for the virtuous, no eternal punishment reserved specifically for the wicked. Kings and paupers alike descended into the same dusty gloom, ate the same clay, and existed in the same diminished, joyless state. Some surviving laments suggest that a person's treatment in the afterlife could be marginally improved by the number of surviving children who continued to make offerings on their behalf, tying the fate of the dead directly to the ongoing devotion of the living. But even this was a matter of degree, rather than any true escape from the underworld's fundamental greyness. The myth of how Ereshkigal came to rule this realm is described in the same tablets that discuss Inanna's descent, framing her position almost as an unwanted inheritance rather than an ambition she pursued. Some versions of Sumerian mythology suggest that Ereshkigal was essentially given the underworld as her domain during the earliest divisions of the cosmos, separated from her siblings who received the sky, the air, and the fresh waters, left instead with the one realm that offered no return trips, no visits from admirers, no worship in bright temples filled with music and incense. The physical geography of the underworld, as described across various Sumerian texts, involved a specific and consistent set of features that any soul traveling there could expect to encounter. A great river that had to be crossed, sometimes with the aid of a ferryman figure, the 7 gates we've already discussed in relation to Inanna's journey, and finally Ereshkigal's own palace at the centre, built, according to some descriptions, entirely from precious lapis lazuli, a striking and almost ironic detail given how thoroughly joyless and dust-covered the rest of the realm was described as being. This combination of material splendour and existential bleakness, a beautiful palace ruling over an endless grey wasteland of suffering souls, captures something essential about how the Sumerians understood power itself, that even the most absolute and materially impressive authority offered no guarantee of genuine happiness or companionship to the one who held it. This isolation makes her fury toward Inanna during the events we just described entirely understandable rather than simply villainous. Here was a sister who could travel freely between realms, who was worshipped with passionate devotion across multiple cities, who had lovers and adventures and triumphant returns from every conflict she entered, arriving uninvited into the one domain Ereshkigal could never leave, apparently attempting to claim it for herself as well. Ereshkigal's decision to strike Inanna down and hang her corpse on the wall reads, in this light, less as random cruelty and more as the reaction of someone finally asserting control over the single thing that was unambiguously hers. Some Sumerian texts describe Ereshkigal weeping alone in her palace, described in laments as a woman without comfort, without a husband to hold her, forced to grieve entirely on her own terms because no one, not even the other gods, dared approach her realm to offer sympathy. This portrait of profound loneliness recurs across multiple surviving fragments, and it stands in genuinely stark contrast to almost every other deity in the pantheon we've discussed tonight, nearly all of whom exist within networks of marriages, children, siblings, and allies who actively support them through their various trials. Ereshkigal, ruling absolutely over the largest population in the entire cosmology, the sum total of every human who had ever died, was nonetheless described as utterly alone. But Ereshkigal's story doesn't end with that confrontation. In fact, one of the most fascinating myths involving her occurs afterward, when the gods above, perhaps out of guilt over how she had been treated, or perhaps recognizing that her isolation had gone on long enough, decided to send her a companion. And this is where Ereshkigal's story intersects with a plague god whose arrival in the underworld begins with violence and ends, remarkably, in genuine love. That god was Nergal, and the story of how he went from an intended executioner to Ereshkigal's husband and co-ruler of the underworld is one of the strangest and most surprisingly touching myths in the entire Sumerian and Babylonian tradition. Nergal, the war god who conquered death itself. Nergal was a god associated with war, plague, and the scorching destructive heat of the summer sun, a figure whose presence in any city was regarded with dread rather than celebration. His main cult center was the city of Kutha, and his temple there, known as Meslam, gave him one of his most common titles, Lord of Meslam. Where Utu represented the sun's life-giving judicial qualities, Nergal represented its capacity to scorch, to wither crops, and to bring the kind of fevered illness that could sweep through a city and leave devastation in its wake. Kutha's association with Nergal was strong enough that the city's very name became a kind of shorthand for the underworld itself in later Mesopotamian literature, with references to descending to Kutha, sometimes used as a poetic stand-in for death more broadly, much as some traditions today might reference someone meeting their maker. This linguistic slippage between an actual physical city on the Mesopotamian plain and the realm of the dead itself speaks to just how thoroughly Nergal's grim reputation had saturated the popular imagination of the people who lived alongside his worship for thousands of years. The myth that connects Nergal most directly to the underworld and to Ereshkigal begins with an act of disrespect rather than romance. According to the story, the gods of heaven held a great banquet, and out of courtesy, they sent an invitation down to Ereshkigal as well, recognizing that as ruler of the underworld, she could not leave her realm to attend in person, and so a messenger was sent to receive her portion of the feast on her behalf. When this messenger arrived among the assembled gods, every deity present rose respectfully from their seats to honor Ereshkigal's representative. Every deity except Nergal, who remained seated, whether out of arrogance, distraction, or simple carelessness, the tablets don't fully clarify. This detail, small as it seems, carried enormous social weight in the world the Sumerians and later Babylonians inhabited. Standing to honor a visiting messenger, particularly one representing a ruler as powerful and feared as Ereshkigal, was a basic and non-negotiable point of etiquette. Nergal's refusal to rise wasn't a minor social stumble. It was read by everyone present as a calculated insult, a young, aggressive war god refusing to acknowledge the authority of a queen who ruled a realm he perhaps regarded as beneath his own martial glory. The gods present were reportedly shocked by the breach, understanding immediately that this slight would not go unanswered. This slight was reported back to Ereshkigal, and she was, understandably, deeply insulted. She demanded that Nergal be sent down to the underworld to answer for his disrespect, and the other gods, recognizing the seriousness of offending the Queen of the Dead, agreed. But rather than sending Nergal down defenseless, the god Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, equipped him with knowledge and protective measures before his departure, including instructions on how to resist Ereshkigal's authority and, crucially, warnings not to accept any food, drink, or comfort offered to him in the underworld, since doing so would trap him there permanently, echoing the same kind of warning given to Adapa in his own journey to the heavens. When Nergal descended, armed with this knowledge, he refused every offer of hospitality extended to him, seemingly poised for a confrontation rather than a peaceful resolution. But upon actually encountering Ereshkigal, something entirely unexpected happened. Rather than the violent confrontation the setup seemed to promise, the two were overcome with desire for one another, and what follows in the myth is described as an intense, passionate affair lasting 6 days, at the end of which Nergal, remembering his instructions and perhaps growing uneasy about the implications of remaining in the underworld, secretly fled back to the world above without any formal farewell. The abruptness of Nergal's departure, slipping away while Ereshkigal slept rather than confronting her directly, adds a genuinely uncomfortable emotional dimension to this myth, one that mirrors, in miniature, the same pattern of betrayal and abandonment that defines the Dumuzi and Inanna story we'll return to shortly. Time and again in Sumerian mythology, passionate unions curdle into abandonment, and the abandoned party responds not with quiet acceptance, but with genuine world-altering fury. Ereshkigal's threat to raise the dead and send them to devour the living stands as one of the most viscerally frightening threats made by any deity across this entire pantheon, a threat taken seriously enough that the full assembly of gods immediately capitulated rather than risk testing her resolve. Ereshkigal, left behind, was consumed by a grief that quickly turned into fury. She sent a messenger to the heavens, threatening that if Nergal was not returned to her, she would raise the dead themselves, sending them up to devour the living, a threat serious enough that the assembled gods took it with complete seriousness. Nergal was ultimately sent back down to the underworld, this time to stay, and rather than a forced arrangement, the surviving versions of the myth suggest that Nergal returned willingly, having genuinely fallen for Ereshkigal, despite his initial resistance and his attempt to escape. Upon his permanent return, according to the most complete surviving version of this story, Nergal stormed through the gates of the underworld, subduing the guardians there and asserting his authority alongside Ereshkigal rather than beneath her, and the two were formally married, becoming joint rulers of the realm of the dead. What began as a diplomatic insult and a punitive assignment transformed into a genuine, if unconventional, partnership, one that finally gave Ereshkigal the companionship her isolated position had denied her for so long. The manner of Nergal's second descent stands in deliberate, striking contrast to his first. Where he had initially travelled down cautiously, following Ea's careful instructions and refusing every offer of comfort out of fear of entrapment, his second journey is described with real aggression and confidence, smashing through each of the 7 gates in turn, rather than passing through them politely, as Inanna had been forced to do. This shift from cautious visitor to conquering equal mirrors the emotional arc of the entire myth, tracing Nergal's transformation from a reluctant, almost resentful participant in this diplomatic mission into someone who actively chose to claim both Ereshkigal and her throne as his own, regardless of what the rest of the divine assembly might have preferred. This myth carried real weight in Mesopotamian religious practice, since Nergal's association with plague meant that his worship often involved attempts to appease him during times of illness or military conflict, treating him as a god whose destructive tendencies needed to be managed and redirected rather than simply endured. Cities facing outbreaks of disease frequently made offerings specifically to Nergal, hoping to convince him to withhold the pestilence associated with his domain. Beyond outright plague, Nergal's domain also extended to the scorching heat of the height of summer, a season the Sumerians and later Mesopotamians regarded with genuine dread given how it could wither crops and bring outbreaks of illness in its wake. Prayers addressed to him during these months often combined flattery of his martial power with pleading for mercy, a combination that recurs throughout Mesopotamian religious literature whenever worshippers addressed gods whose domains were fundamentally destructive. Rather than simply avoiding mention of Nergal's more frightening qualities, these prayers embraced them directly, praising his ferocity in the same breath as begging him to direct that ferocity elsewhere, a rhetorical strategy that reflects a broader Mesopotamian approach to placating dangerous divine forces through acknowledgement rather than denial. Later Babylonian and Assyrian texts expanded on Nergal's dual nature as both destroyer and, through his marriage to Ereshkigal, a figure of eventual stability and partnership, and some inscriptions from Assyrian kings invoke him alongside more overtly militaristic gods when describing their campaigns of conquest, crediting him with the plagues and devastation that swept through enemy territories during prolonged sieges. This association between Nergal and the very real, documented outbreaks of disease that plagued ancient Mesopotamian military campaigns suggests that his mythology wasn't purely abstract to the people who told it. It reflected genuine, lived anxiety about the diseases that could decimate an army or a city faster than any human enemy, giving a name and a face to a threat that otherwise felt random and unanswerable. With Nergal settled beside Ereshkigal, the underworld finally had its co-rulers, its dark mirror to the partnerships and family structures found among the gods above. But there was one more god of war and destruction in the Sumerian pantheon, a figure whose specific role centered not on the underworld but on the battlefield itself, and on a heroic conflict against monstrous forces that threatened to overturn the natural order of creation entirely. Ninurta, the warrior who battled a mountain of stone. Ninurta, son of Enlil, was celebrated across Sumerian tradition as a god of war, agriculture, and the life-giving floods that renewed the fields each year, a combination that might seem contradictory at first, but made perfect sense within the Sumerian worldview, where the same forces of nature capable of destruction were equally capable of bringing fertility and abundance. He was worshipped extensively in the city of Nippur, sharing prominence there with his father Enlil, and also held a significant cult center in the city of Girsu. His relationship with his father Enlil across the surviving mythology tends to be one of loyal service rather than rivalry, with Ninurta frequently depicted as the enforcer who carries out the more dangerous, hands-on tasks required to protect the order that Enlil presides over from a more distant administrative position. This dynamic mirrors, in some respects, the relationship between An and Enlil discussed earlier, a pattern of authority passing from a more passive, foundational figure to an active agent willing to personally confront threats, suggesting that the Sumerians found something narratively satisfying in this recurring structure of quiet authority paired with an active, capable enforcer willing to do the difficult work that authority alone couldn't accomplish. The defining myth of Ninurta's career, and the story that cemented his reputation as one of the pantheon's great heroic figures, centers on his battle against a monstrous being called Asag, sometimes described as a demon born from the union of An and the earth itself, whose very presence caused stones and rocks to rise up in rebellion against the natural order, forming an army of animated boulders under Asag's command. According to the myth, Asag's rise to power caused catastrophic disruption throughout the land. Rivers stopped flowing properly, fields lost their fertility, and the balance the Sumerians believed governed their entire civilization began to collapse. Ninurta, recognizing the severity of the threat, took up his weapons, including a mace named Sharur that the tablets describe as possessing its own consciousness and voice, capable of speaking with Ninurta and offering counsel before and during the battle, an unusually vivid detail even by the standards of Sumerian mythology, where sentient weapons are rare. The battle between Ninurta and Asag, along with Asag's army of stone warriors, is described in dramatic, almost apocalyptic terms across the surviving tablets, with the very foundations of heaven and earth said to tremble under the force of their conflict. Ninurta ultimately triumphed, slaying Asag and, in the aftermath, turning his attention to the defeated stone army, a detail that reveals a surprisingly constructive and administrative side to this war god's character. Rather than simply destroying the various stones and rocks that had fought against him, Ninurta assigned each type of stone a specific value and purpose going forward, decreeing which stones would be prized for construction, which would be valuable for jewelry, and which would remain common and unremarkable. In doing so, Ninurta essentially established the entire hierarchy of value for stones and minerals that Sumerian civilization would use going forward, transforming an act of war into an act of civilizational organization. This particular section of the myth reads almost like a catalogue, naming specific stones one after another and pronouncing judgment on each. Some cursed to remain weak and brittle as punishment for having sided with Asag, others blessed and elevated in value as a reward for remaining loyal to the natural order during the rebellion. Precious stones like carnelian and lapis lazuli, both highly prized throughout Mesopotamian trade networks, are specifically named among those Ninurta blessed, giving this portion of the myth a function not unlike an origin story explaining why certain minerals commanded such high value in Sumerian society, tracing that value directly back to a single divine judgment issued in the aftermath of one of the pantheon's most consequential battles. The talking mace Sharur deserves particular attention, since sentient weapons are genuinely rare across Sumerian mythology. According to the surviving fragments, Sharur didn't simply fight alongside Ninurta, but actively scouted ahead of him, flying across vast distances to assess the scale of Asag's rebellion, before returning to report back and offer strategic counsel, at times even expressing doubt about whether Ninurta could actually win the coming confrontation, doubts that Ninurta had to overcome through sheer determination and confidence in his own strength. This dynamic between a god and his own weapon, one capable of doubt, counsel, and independent assessment, adds a surprisingly intimate, almost buddy narrative texture to what is otherwise one of the most cosmically destructive battles described anywhere in Sumerian literature. Following this victory, Ninurta also took credit, according to some versions of the myth, for restoring the flow of the rivers, which had been disrupted during Asag's reign, and for enabling the fields surrounding Sumerian cities to flourish once again, tying his identity as a warrior directly to his identity as a bringer of agricultural prosperity. This dual role made him an especially popular figure among Sumerian kings, who frequently invoked him both before military campaigns and during agricultural festivals, seeking his blessing for victory on the battlefield and abundance in the fields alike. This pairing of warfare and agriculture within a single deity reflects a practical reality of life in ancient Sumer that's easy to overlook today. The same canals and irrigation systems that made farming possible were also frequent sources of conflict between competing city-states who fought bitterly over water rights and boundary lines, sometimes escalating into full military campaigns fought explicitly over control of irrigation infrastructure. A god who could both win battles and restore the fertility of disputed farmland wasn't a contradiction to the Sumerians. He was, in a very real sense, addressing two sides of the exact same underlying concern: the survival and prosperity of a civilization built entirely around control of scarce water resources in an otherwise unforgiving, arid landscape. Ninurta's iconography typically depicts him as a heavily armed warrior, sometimes shown with wings, standing triumphant over defeated enemies or mythical creatures, and later Assyrian kings would adopt much of his imagery and mythology to reinforce their own claims to martial glory and divine favour in battle. Some scholars have also drawn connections between Ninurta's monster-slaying narrative and later heroic myths across the ancient world, suggesting that the basic structure of a heroic warrior god defeating a chaos monster and reorganizing creation in the aftermath became a template that echoed forward into Babylonian, Greek, and even more distant mythological traditions. Beyond the Asag myth, Ninurta appears in several other stories centered on defending the natural and cosmic order against various monstrous threats, including a giant bird called Anzu, who, in one of the more audacious thefts in the entire pantheon, stole the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil while he bathed, an object believed to grant its holder ultimate authority over fate itself. Ninurta was dispatched to retrieve it, and the resulting battle, fought high above the earth as Anzu attempted to flee with his stolen prize, became yet another defining episode in Ninurta's reputation as the pantheon's primary enforcer against threats too dangerous for the older, more established gods to handle directly themselves. The theft of the Tablet of Destinies represented an almost existential threat to the entire cosmic order as the Sumerians understood it, since whoever possessed this object could theoretically dictate the fate of gods and mortals alike, overriding even the authority of An and Enlil. Anzu's audacity in stealing it directly from Enlil's own sanctuary, exploiting a moment of vulnerability while the god bathed, sent a wave of genuine panic through the divine assembly, and several other prominent gods reportedly declined the dangerous task of confronting Anzu before Ninurta finally accepted the challenge, cementing his reputation as the one deity willing to take on threats that even his more senior relatives found too intimidating to face directly. With the battles of gods like Nergal and Ninurta behind us, it's worth turning now to a very different kind of deity, one whose contribution to Sumerian civilization had nothing to do with weapons or conquest, and everything to do with something the Sumerians valued just as highly: the written word itself. Nisaba, the goddess who invented writing. Nisaba occupied a role in Sumerian religion that modern audiences often find genuinely surprising, given how little attention she receives compared to the more dramatic gods of war, love, and death. She was the goddess of writing, grain, accounting, and scribal knowledge, and in a civilization that invented the very concept of written language, her domain touched nearly every aspect of daily administrative and religious life. Nisaba's association with grain came first, historically speaking, and reflects her origins as a fertility and harvest goddess connected to the abundance of the fields. Her name itself is believed to derive from words associated with grain, and early depictions show her crowned with stalks of barley, reflecting her role in ensuring successful harvests across Sumerian farmland. But over time, her domain expanded in a direction that reflects one of the most consequential developments in all of human history: the invention of writing itself. This connection between grain and writing isn't as strange as it might initially seem, and understanding it helps explain why Nisaba's dual portfolio made perfect sense to the Sumerians themselves. The very earliest cuneiform tablets ever discovered, dating back over 5,000 years, aren't works of literature or religious texts at all. They're administrative records, tracking grain harvests, livestock counts, and temple distributions of barley and other goods. Writing itself was invented, first and foremost, as a practical tool for managing agricultural surplus and taxation, meaning that Nisaba's evolution from a simple harvest goddess into the patron of scribal knowledge reflects the actual historical sequence of how writing itself came into being, born directly out of the practical need to track the very grain she had always been associated with. As Sumerian civilization developed increasingly complex systems for tracking grain harvests, taxation, trade, and temple offerings, the practical need for record-keeping gave rise to cuneiform script, one of the very first writing systems ever developed by any human civilization. Nisaba became closely associated with this new technology, credited as the divine patron of scribes, the professional class responsible for maintaining these written records. Scribal schools across Sumerian cities, known as edubas, frequently invoked her as a protective and inspirational figure, and successful scribes often closed their completed tablets with a dedication to her, crediting their skill and knowledge to her divine influence. This connection between Nisaba and writing carried enormous social weight in Sumerian society, since literacy was a rare and highly valued skill, typically restricted to a relatively small class of professional scribes who underwent years of rigorous training to master the hundreds of distinct cuneiform signs needed to read and write competently. These scribes held significant social influence, serving as administrators, accountants, legal record keepers, and preservers of religious and literary texts, and Nisaba's patronage of their profession placed her at the center of Sumerian intellectual and administrative life, even though she rarely appears as a dramatic character in the same way gods like Inanna or Enki do. The training these scribes underwent was notoriously demanding, and surviving school texts describe long days spent copying and recopying tablets, memorizing sign lists, and enduring strict discipline from instructors, sometimes referred to in student compositions as big brothers within the school hierarchy. Students who performed poorly faced physical punishment, according to some surviving accounts written by students themselves, complaining good-naturedly, or perhaps not so good-naturedly, about the difficulty of their training. Despite these hardships, completing scribal training offered a genuine path to social advancement, and Nisaba's patronage of this profession meant that her worship was deeply tied to some of the only realistic avenues for upward mobility that existed within the rigid social structure of Sumerian civilization. One particularly charming surviving text, sometimes referred to by modern scholars as a school day composition, describes a young student's entire routine from morning to night, including his walk to school, his meals, his lessons, and his eventual return home, where his father questions him about his progress and rewards good behavior with praise and gifts. These small personal glimpses into the daily experience of Sumerian education, preserved purely by accident among thousands of more mundane administrative tablets, give us an unusually intimate window into a childhood lived 5,000 years ago, one governed ultimately by devotion to the same goddess of writing whose broader mythology we've just discussed. One surviving myth describes a kind of divine rivalry or transition of authority over the scribal arts, in which the god Nabu, who would later become far more prominent in Babylonian religion as the god of writing and wisdom, gradually absorbed and eclipsed much of Nisaba's earlier role. Some tablets describe this transition almost as an inheritance or a marriage alliance, with Nisaba training or being succeeded by Nabu as the primary deity associated with the scribal arts, reflecting how Mesopotamian religion continued to evolve and reorganize its pantheon over the centuries as different cities and empires rose to dominance. This kind of gradual replacement, where an older deity's core function is absorbed by a newer, rising god without ever being formally denounced or erased, happened repeatedly across Mesopotamian religious history, and it offers a fascinating window into how ancient religions actually evolved in practice, rather than through the kind of sudden doctrinal breaks more familiar from later religious history. Nisaba wasn't cast down or vilified as Nabu's prominence grew. She simply receded gradually into a kind of honoured ancestral status, her name still invoked in blessings and scribal colophons, even centuries after Nabu had become the primary deity, petitioned by working scribes across Babylon and Assyria. It's a quieter, gentler kind of religious transition than the dramatic battles and betrayals that mark so many of the other myths in this pantheon, and it reflects a civilization that valued continuity and respect for its own foundational traditions, even while adapting to new religious and political realities. Nisaba's importance, though quieter than some of her more dramatic counterparts, cannot be overstated when considering the broader arc of human history. Writing itself, first developed in Sumer for practical purposes like tracking grain stores and temple offerings, would go on to become the foundation for literature, law, science, and historical record-keeping across every subsequent civilization. In a very real sense, every book, every written law, every preserved historical account owes something to the intellectual tradition that the Sumerians first attributed to Nisaba's divine inspiration. Her temples often included substantial libraries of clay tablets, and archaeologists excavating Sumerian religious sites have discovered vast collections of administrative and literary texts within temple complexes associated with her worship, providing modern historians with an extraordinary window into the daily workings of one of humanity's earliest civilizations. It's genuinely remarkable, when you consider it, that everything we know about the other 13 gods in this very video, the flood myth, Inanna's descent, Enki's drunken generosity, has survived only because Nisaba's scribes painstakingly pressed reed styluses into wet clay, tablet after tablet, preserving stories that would otherwise have vanished entirely along with the civilization that told them. In a very real sense, she is the reason any of tonight's stories could be told at all, the quiet goddess whose scribes made memory itself possible. From the goddess who gave the Sumerians their words, we now return to the story we left unfinished earlier tonight, the fate of the shepherd king Dumuzi, dragged into the underworld by demons after Inanna's fury at his apparent lack of grief. His story, and the devotion of the sister who refused to abandon him, brings us to one of the most quietly moving conclusions in the entire Sumerian mythological tradition. Dumuzi, the shepherd king dragged to the underworld. Dumuzi was a shepherd and, according to some traditions, a historical king of Uruk as well, whose marriage to Inanna represented one of the most celebrated divine unions in Sumerian religious life. Their courtship, described in a collection of surprisingly tender and sensual poems, was celebrated annually through a sacred marriage rite performed by Sumerian kings, who symbolically took on the role of Dumuzi in a ceremony meant to guarantee fertility and prosperity for the land in the coming year. The courtship poems themselves are among the most strikingly intimate literary works to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, describing Dumuzi and Inanna's mutual attraction in vivid, joyful language, with Dumuzi frequently praised for the abundance of his flocks and Inanna delighting in his devotion. Interestingly, some versions of their courtship describe a rivalry between Dumuzi, the shepherd, and a farmer god competing for Inanna's affection, with Inanna initially favouring the farmer before being persuaded by Dumuzi's own passionate arguments about the superior gifts a shepherd could offer: wool, milk, and cheese, compared to mere vegetables and grain. This playful competition, resolved in Dumuzi's favour, set the stage for a marriage that Sumerian kings would ritually reenact for centuries, believing that their symbolic union with Inanna during this ceremony directly guaranteed the fertility of the land and the livestock under their rule. But as we already covered, this celebrated marriage ended in devastating betrayal. When Inanna returned from the underworld accompanied by demons who required a substitute to take her place among the dead, she found Dumuzi seated comfortably on her throne, showing no visible signs of grief over her apparent death. In her fury, she pointed the demons toward him, and they seized him and began dragging him down toward the underworld. What follows is one of the more harrowing chase sequences in Sumerian mythology. Dumuzi, desperate to escape his fate, attempted repeatedly to flee, transforming himself with the help of the sun god Utu, his brother-in-law, into various forms, including a snake and a gazelle, trying to outrun the relentless demons pursuing him across the landscape. Despite these efforts, the demons eventually cornered and captured him, and he was ultimately taken down into the underworld to take Inanna's place among the dead. The surviving laments describing this pursuit dwell on Dumuzi's terror in language that feels genuinely affecting even across the distance of 5,000 years, describing him weeping, pleading with Utu for aid, and running desperately from field to field trying to find somewhere the demons could not follow. At one point, according to the text, he hides among reeds and sheepfolds, anywhere that might offer temporary shelter, and the demons methodically search each hiding place in turn, their pursuit described with a relentless, almost mechanical inevitability that makes clear from the outset that Dumuzi's fate was already sealed the moment Inanna pointed them in his direction. This is where Dumuzi's sister, a goddess named Geshtinanna, enters the story, and her role transforms this myth from a straightforward tale of punishment into something far more emotionally complex. Geshtinanna, described in the surviving texts as a goddess associated with the harvest, wine, and the interpretation of dreams, had already tried to warn her brother of the danger approaching him, having interpreted a series of troubling dreams that foretold his capture. When Dumuzi was ultimately dragged away despite her warnings, Geshtinanna refused to abandon him, searching desperately for him and eventually following him down into the underworld itself, offering herself as a substitute in his place. Faced with this display of devotion, and with both siblings now presenting themselves before her, Ereshkigal, along with Inanna, arrived at a resolution that speaks directly to how the Sumerians understood the changing of the seasons and the natural cycle of agricultural life. Rather than condemning one sibling permanently while freeing the other entirely, it was decided that Dumuzi and Geshtinanna would each spend half of the year in the underworld, alternating with one another, so that for 6 months Dumuzi would live among the dead while his sister lived among the living, and for the remaining 6 months the arrangement would reverse. This resolution is genuinely remarkable when compared to the harsh, often unforgiving logic that governs most of the other myths in this pantheon. Rather than a strict permanent punishment or a simple pardon, the gods arrived at something closer to a negotiated compromise, one that acknowledged both Dumuzi's failure to properly mourn his wife and Geshtinana's genuine, uncoerced love for her brother. It's worth noting that nowhere else in Sumerian mythology do we see quite this kind of split custody arrangement applied to the underworld's absolute laws, suggesting that the sheer force of sibling devotion displayed by Geshtinana was powerful enough to bend rules that had proven completely immovable in every other context, including Inanna's own desperate attempts to avoid death entirely. This alternating arrangement mapped directly onto the agricultural calendar the Sumerians depended upon for their survival. Dumuzi's descent into the underworld coincided with the hot, dry summer months, when vegetation withered and the fields lay barren, while his return to the world above coincided with the fertile growing season, when crops flourished and Sumerian communities celebrated his return with festivals of mourning, transitioning into festivals of joy as the agricultural cycle turned once again. These seasonal mourning rituals, sometimes referred to by scholars as the lamentations for Dumuzi, were performed annually across Sumerian and later Babylonian cities, with women in particular playing a central ceremonial role in publicly grieving his descent each year, a practice that persisted for thousands of years and is even referenced disapprovingly many centuries later in the biblical Book of Ezekiel, where women are described weeping for a figure called Tammuz, the later Semitic name for Dumuzi, at the very gates of a Jerusalem temple. This remarkable detail shows just how far and how long the memory of this Sumerian shepherd king's tragic fate travelled across cultures and centuries, still recognizable enough to warrant mention in a text written well over 1,000 years after the earliest Sumerian versions of his story were first composed. Geshtinana, the sister who chose sacrifice. Geshtinana's willingness to take her brother's place, even temporarily, stands as one of the most genuinely selfless acts performed by any deity across the entire Sumerian pantheon, especially notable in a mythology otherwise filled with gods pursuing personal ambition, jealousy, and self-interest. Her association with dream interpretation made her a valuable figure for Sumerian religious practice more broadly, since dreams were taken extremely seriously as messages from the divine realm, and priests and diviners frequently invoked her wisdom when attempting to interpret troubling or significant dreams brought to them by worried petitioners. The dream that Geshtinana interprets for her brother early in the myth is described in unsettling symbolic detail, involving images of a single reed standing alone and being uprooted, a fire being kindled and then abandoned, and a falcon seizing a sparrow from a fence, each image foreshadowing a specific stage of Dumuzi's coming capture and death. Geshtinana's ability to correctly decode these ominous symbols, even though her warning ultimately couldn't prevent the disaster she foresaw, established her as a figure whose wisdom operated on a register different from her brother's, one rooted in careful observation and interpretation, rather than the impulsive, reactive decisions that define so many of the other myths we've covered tonight. Beyond her role in Dumuzi's story, Geshtinana was also associated with the cultivation of grapes and the production of wine, linking her, alongside her brother's association with shepherding and dairy, to the broader theme of agricultural abundance that ran throughout their shared mythology. Her willingness to split the year with her brother, rather than allow him to suffer eternal punishment, reflects a value the Sumerians clearly held in high regard: loyalty and sacrifice within family bonds, even when the individuals involved were divine rather than mortal. Some scholars have noted an interesting symmetry in how Dumuzi and Geshtinana's respective domains, dairy and wine, actually reflect the practical agricultural calendar of ancient Mesopotamia rather directly, since sheep were generally milked most heavily in the spring months when Dumuzi's myth places him among the living, while grape harvest and the early stages of winemaking traditionally occurred later in the year, closer to the season when Geshtinana's own time among the living was said to end. This alignment between mythological narrative and actual agricultural practice reinforces just how deeply these stories were woven into the practical, seasonal rhythms of daily Sumerian life, functioning simultaneously as religious narrative and as a kind of mnemonic calendar reminding farmers and shepherds when to expect each stage of their working year. The story of Dumuzi and Geshtinana's shared fate gave the Sumerians a mythological framework for understanding something they observed every single year without fail: the death of vegetation during the dry season and its triumphant return during the growing season, transforming what could have been understood as a random or frightening natural cycle into a story of sibling devotion, loss, and eventual, if partial, restoration. With the cycle of the seasons explained through the devotion of these two siblings, only one deity remains among our 14, a goddess whose specific domain touched every single Sumerian household in a way perhaps more immediate and personal than any other god we've discussed tonight. Gula, the healer who walked among the suffering. Gula, sometimes known by the earlier name Ninisina in certain Sumerian city traditions, held the vital role of goddess of healing and medicine, a domain that placed her in direct practical relevance to the daily lives of ordinary Sumerians in a way that more abstract cosmic gods rarely achieved. Illness and injury were constant, unavoidable realities in the ancient world, and Gula's worship reflected a genuine, urgent human need for relief from suffering, disease, and the ever-present threat of death from infection or plague. Gula's primary cult centers included the cities of Isin and later Nippur, and her temples often functioned as something resembling early medical centers, staffed by priests who combined religious ritual with practical medical knowledge, including herbal remedies, wound treatment, and what limited surgical techniques existed at the time. Patients seeking healing would visit her temples, making offerings and undergoing prescribed rituals believed to invoke her healing power, blurring the line between religious devotion and what we might today consider early medical practice. Surviving medical texts from Mesopotamia, some clearly influenced by traditions associated with Gula's priesthood, describe an approach to treatment that combined careful, almost clinical observation of symptoms with ritual incantation, suggesting that ancient Mesopotamian healers didn't see a sharp division between what we would now call medicine and religion. A patient suffering from fever might be prescribed a poultice made from specific plants alongside a recited prayer invoking Gula's mercy, both treatments considered equally necessary parts of the same healing process. This integrated approach persisted for thousands of years across Mesopotamian civilization, and some scholars argue that the careful, systematic symptom tracking found in these medical texts represents one of the earliest examples of methodical medical observation anywhere in the ancient world, predating similar developments in Greek medicine by well over 1,000 years. Gula's titles across various hymns and inscriptions reflect this same practical, hands-on approach to her divinity, with epithets describing her as the one who binds up wounds, who knows the secret of every herb, and who restores breath to the dying, language that emphasizes direct physical intervention rather than distant, abstract blessing. This grounded, practical characterization sets her apart from some of the more cosmic and distant figures we discussed earlier tonight, reinforcing just how personally and immediately relevant her particular domain was to the everyday anxieties of ordinary Sumerian families, who had far more occasion to worry about illness and injury than they did about cosmic order or the movement of celestial bodies. Her most distinctive symbol was the dog, and numerous small dog figurines have been discovered at excavation sites associated with her temples, buried as protective offerings meant to guard against illness and evil forces. Some scholars believe this association may stem from observations of dogs licking wounds, a behavior the Sumerians may have associated with healing properties, though the exact origin of this connection remains debated among historians. Regardless of its precise origin, the image of Gula accompanied by a faithful dog became one of the most recognizable representations of healing deity iconography throughout ancient Mesopotamia, an image that would echo forward into later cultures that similarly associated dogs with medicine and healing. At her major temple complex in Isin, archaeologists have uncovered an entire dedicated burial ground for dogs, some interred with clear ritual care, providing physical, tangible evidence of just how central this symbolic association was to her actual worship practices rather than existing purely as an artistic convention. Dozens of dog skeletons have been recovered from this site, many of them small breeds that appear to have been specifically bred or kept for temple use, and the careful nature of their burials, often in individual graves rather than discarded haphazardly, suggests these animals held genuine religious significance to the priests and worshippers who tended Gula's sanctuary, treated as living embodiments of the goddess's healing presence rather than simple pets or working animals. Gula's mythology, unlike the dramatic sagas of gods like Inanna or Ninurta, tends to be quieter and more concerned with her ongoing relationship with human suffering than with grand cosmic conflicts. Hymns dedicated to her frequently describe her walking among the sick, personally administering care, and her titles included phrases that translate roughly to Great Healer and Lady who Restores Life, emphasizing her direct hands-on relationship with human well-being rather than a distant, abstract form of divine authority. As Mesopotamian religion evolved into the Babylonian and Assyrian periods, Gula's importance only grew, and she eventually became closely associated with the broader concept of medicine itself, with physicians throughout the ancient Near East invoking her name in medical texts and prayers accompanying treatment. Her enduring legacy reflects something the Sumerians clearly understood deeply, that healing, comfort, and the alleviation of suffering deserved their own dedicated place among the divine, standing alongside gods of storms, war, and cosmic order as an equally essential part of how their civilization understood the world around them. It's worth noting that Gula's priesthood existed alongside, and sometimes in productive tension with, a separate class of Mesopotamian diviners and exorcists who approached illness from a different angle entirely, treating certain ailments as the result of demonic influence or divine punishment requiring ritual expulsion rather than direct medical treatment. Gula's tradition, by contrast, leaned more heavily toward what we might recognize today as empirical treatment, tracking symptoms, testing remedies, and refining approaches based on observed outcomes over successive generations of practice. The coexistence of these two approaches within the same broader religious culture, one oriented towards spiritual diagnosis and one toward physical treatment, gave ancient Mesopotamian patients access to a surprisingly comprehensive range of healing traditions. Whichever explanation for their suffering ultimately proved most convincing or most effective. And with Gula, we've now travelled through all 14 of the great gods and goddesses who shaped one of the oldest civilizations in human history. From An's distant authority in the sky, to Enlil's devastating flood, to Enki's endless cleverness and compassion, to Ninhursag's painful creation of healing itself, to Nanna's steady moonlit cycles, to Utu's unblinking daily judgment, to Inanna's descent into death and resurrection, to Ereshkigal's lonely rule finally softened by love, to Nergal's transformation from executioner to devoted husband, to Ninurta's triumph over a mountain of living stone, to Nisaba's gift of writing itself, to Dumuzi and Geshtinana's sacrifice that explained the changing of the seasons, and finally to Gula, walking quietly among the sick and suffering with a healer's patient devotion. These weren't distant, untouchable figures to the people who worshipped them nearly 5,000 years ago. They were present in every harvest, every illness, every night sky, every written word, every changing season. They explained a world that otherwise offered no explanations, and in doing so, they laid a foundation that would influence religious thought across the entire ancient world for thousands of years to come, echoing forward into the myths of Babylon, Assyria, and eventually into stories that still shape how billions of people understand the divine today. What's perhaps most striking, looking back across all 14 of these figures together, is how thoroughly human their struggles remain despite the thousands of years separating us from the people who first told these stories. Gods wept, gods made mistakes, gods fell in love unexpectedly, gods grieved lost companionship, and gods occasionally had to accept compromises rather than total victory. The Sumerians didn't imagine perfect, distant beings entirely removed from struggle and consequence. They imagined a divine world that mirrored their own, full of the same jealousy, love, ambition, and quiet sacrifice found in any human family, just magnified onto a canvas broad enough to explain the sun, the moon, the seasons, and the fate of every soul that ever lived and died along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Somewhere in modern Iraq tonight, the mud brick foundations of Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Ur, and Kutha still lie beneath the earth, largely unexcavated, holding within them thousands of tablets yet to be uncovered and translated, quite possibly containing entire myths about these same 14 gods that no living person has read in over 4,000 years. Every new excavation season carries the possibility of recovering some fragment of the pantheon story that has been silent since before the pyramids of Egypt were built, a genuinely humbling thought when you consider just how much of human civilization's earliest religious imagination still remains buried, waiting patiently in the dark, much like the dead the Sumerians themselves believed rested quietly beneath Ereshkigal's watchful, unblinking rule. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.